You really want to see the Roman Empire?
How?
With this book.
Imagine this. It's 2 o'clock in the morning somewhere of deep Germany. The year can be which, between the 1st and 2nd centuries of our era. The air smells like wet pine, too freshly removed earth and burnt wood. Beyond the illuminated perimeter where the torches barely bend against the north wind, the forests are black and absolutely silent. German tribes know every tree, every bottom, every ravine in that territory, have lived in these forests for generations, yet, within the perimeter, 5,000 men sleep. Do not sleep half asleep. Do not sleep with one eye open, the rampaging heart and the gladius pressed against the chest. They sleep with a depth that they only give two things together: physical exhaustion, genuine after a day of 30 kilometers, carrying 40 kilos of equipment, and absolute confidence in the system around them. While doing so, that's exactly what no one explains about Rome. When people imagine a roaming army in enemy territory, imagine something resembling a survival adventure. Soldiers sleeping where they can, half-asleep guards mounted on their spears. The constant threat of a night attack that could end with everything in minutes. That image is understandable. Is the reality of practically all the armies that existed before and after Rome for 1,000 years. The dream in the campaign was, for most of the armies of antiquity, a problem with no real solution, a vulnerability that you accepted and hoped not to pay dearly for. Roma did not accept it. What Rome built around the act of sleeping in hostile territory was something that no Columbian army could match. And that no normie, the medieval, was not the product of superior technology, was the product of something more difficult to manufacture. A system, a series of logistics, engineering, and discipline decisions that were executed with such precision and so consistently that the average leader, the man of the last rank, the thousands, Rius carrying the pilum and digging the trenches, could place complete trust in them. To understand how he slept, a roaming soldier in the middle of enemy territory first, you have to understand what I was doing, that the night would be so dangerous for any army, OLD. And the answer is not only the surprise attack, although that was the most obvious. The real night in the campaign was the issue of in the dark without watches, no instant communication, no coordinated signals. The hierarchy of an army becomes invisible. The centurion cannot see his 80 men. The optio, the second in command of the cannot verify positions. The men on guard, reactions cannot be confirmed without noise. If an attack at night broke through the perimeter of an unorganized camp, the most likely outcome was not a battle, was a stampede. Men running in the dark, not knowing where to, stumbling upon those who were sleeping, unable to distinguish comrades from enemies, unable to receive orders that no one could communicate. In that chaos, the Gauls knew it. The Germans knew it, the Praetorians knew it. The night attack on the camp was a legitimate and devastatingly effective against almost any army of antiquity. Vulnerability was not in soldiers sleeping, was in that once asleep, the army ceased to exist as an organized unit. Unless you had a designed system, specifically so that it would never happen. The roaming system was beginning, hours before the first legionnaire released his team. began, in fact, before the bulk of the army will arrive at the place where they were going to sleep that night. The mentors were the first to arrive. Military equipment, field geographers month, men trained to read terrain and translate IT into a plane in a matter of minutes. While the main column was still marching, the mensors rode ahead, selected the field according to specific criteria. Gentle slope for drainage, proximity to water without direct exposure to the river, sufficient elevation for access, visibility, and traced the perimeter with instruments and stakes. When legionnaires arrived at the site of the camp, did not reach an open field where they would have to improvise, reached a grid already marked on the ground. That grid was always the same. This is fundamental. The Roman camp El Castra did not vary in its basic structure independently of whether I was in British and Judea, the Danubio, or in the desert of Syria. The same rectangular shape, with the same 4 doors, in the same relative cardinal points. The Porta Praetoria to the front towards the enemy. The Cumana gate in the rear. The 2 doors on the flanks. The same internal street layout. The Praetoria road by cutting the camp longitudinally. The main road crossing it perpendicularly. The Praetorium, the commander's tent. Always at the same point of that intersection. The stores of each cut always in the same sector. Each centuria on its assigned street. Each contubernium in its exact position within that street. Polybius the historian. Discovery that described the Roman system in the 2nd century before Christ with a precision that is still valuable to us today, and pointed out something that for a Columbian should have seemed almost extraordinary. A legionnaire who had served in any other Roman camp could find his way in a camp he had never seen before, in full possession, without asking anyone, knew exactly in which directions your store goes, exactly how many steps from the main road, exactly what cut had on his right and which on his left. Standardization was not aesthetic. WAS functional was the mechanism that preserved the army structure in the dark. But before anyone could sleep, the camp had to exist and build an era el active discipline that made rest possible. Each legionnaire arrived at the campsite with his or her ration of tools, not only weapons, construction tools, the Dulusi roast beak, who was as much a part of the standard team as the gladio, the mural pile, the sharp wooden stakes that every soldier transported during the march, and that they were nailed to the top of the gore to form the bind, the shovel, the basket for moving earth. The construction sequence was set. First the pit, the perimeter trench, typically 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep. Although the dimensions varied according to the time available and the perceived threat, the earth excavated from the pit was used to build the ager, the inner embankment that raised the perimeter 1.5 meters or 2 meters above outside ground level. And on the ager went the pillar, stakes driven inwards, are intertwined, to create a barrier that does not require active defenders to be effective. Any attacker who attempted to climb the rope, I would do so on a moving surface, bent down and closed to old age. Writing in the 4th century, but describing a much older tradition, documents the principle with unparalleled clarity. To doubts, the Roman soldier did not come to the campsite to rest, came to work. Rest was the result of work, not its starting point, and that had consequences. Direct information on the quality of the rest. A man who has dug his own trench, that he has lifted with his own hands, the wall behind which he goes to sleep, that has seen, with their own eyes, the complete structure of the perimeter, before going into his store. 8. Sleeps in a different way than a man. WHO simply stops where his legs reach him, and hopes nothing will kill him. It's not just fatigue, it's verified trust. The legionnaire knew that the trench existed because it had dug. I knew that the belong was complete because he had put up his own stakes. Security was not a rumor, was something he had built with his hands that same afternoon. But the pit, the Ager, and the Vallum solved the physical perimeter problem, did not solve the problem of the night itself. The hours of darkness, the movement of time, the constant that no man can sustain, only for 8 consecutive hours. That's why Rome had the vigils. The Roman night and campaign was divided in 4 guard shifts of duration, approximately equal, each of about 3 hours. The first vigil began at dusk, the second in the middle of the night, the third in the coldest and darkest hours before dawn. The fourth ended with the light. The system covered full night hours, without any man had to stand guard for more than his assigned shift, and without any point of the perimeter will not be unattended at any time during the night. The operation of the system depended on several intertwined elements, and the precision of this entanglement was what made it reliable in practice. First, the third. Every night, the Tesorius of every the duty officer, the third man in the chain of command, after centurion and opium, received from headquarters the word pass of the day. A wooden tablet, the third, with the password written. That password was circulating from the praetorium, outward in a chain, from tribune to tribune, from centurion to centurion, of the ESA area, until reaching every man on guard at each position on the perimeter. Any person that could not provide the correct password by being challenged in the dark was by definition someone who should not have been where I was not a perfect system. No system is, but was considerably more effective than any alternative available in the ancient world. And its consistency, through decades of campaigning on multiple fronts, had turned IT into something more powerful than a simple procedure. Was such a deeply internalized fracture that its absence would have been more disconcerting than his presence. Second, the seasons along the perimeter at critical points. The 4 doors, the corners of the camp, the most exposed sectors of the Vallum, had placed fixed where the guards remained throughout his vigil, did not patrol freely, were assigned to a specific point, with a specific visual field, with the responsibility of giving the alarm if something changed within that field of view. Perimeter coverage was not the result of one man. I would like to see everything. Was the result of many men, each one looking at their own sector, whose combined visions left nothing dead. Joseph the historian, Jewish who observed the Roman camps firsthand during the war of the 1st century, you described the discipline of night guarding with an admiration that is difficult to disguise even in translation. The Romans did not leave sleep and rest to chance, as barbarians do, but determined by system, who slept and who watched, and in what way. Was observing something that an external observer was almost supernatural. An army of thousands of men that managed sleep, and as if they were resources managed, not needs that are simply met when possible. But what made the system truly solid was not his design, was what happened when someone failed to comply with it. Falling asleep at the guard post in the Roman army was not a minor disciplinary offense, was in principle a death sentence. The mechanism was called visterium, and in its description in the ancient sources does not leave for ambiguity. The man who was found asleep at his post, or who left his position without authorization, or that in any way compromised the security of the camp during his vigil, was subjected to a process that began with the court hitting him with a cane. Once this contact has been initiated, all the men in the camp were forced to stone and beat him. The goal was not always death, although death was the most likely outcome. The objective was that the act of abandoning the responsibility of guard resulted in such absolute and public consequences that no man on guard, in any condition of exhaustion or coldness or fear, might consider falling asleep for a moment, was an acceptable risk. The severity of the system was deliberate, and it was from the perspective of the Roman army perfectly rational. Why the man who falls asleep at the booth not only fails, he creates a hole in the perimeter, a hole through which they can enter, men who will kill the 5,000 who sleep. The guard's responsibility was not with the system abstract, was with every man asleep behind him, and the fusarium turned it into a responsibility that could not be ignored mentally. The more exhausted, the colder, no matter how miserable you were that night. The practical result was a working perimeter, not because all men were courageous or disciplined by nature, but because the cost of not complying was so concrete and so immediate that the alternative was simply not a real option. And while all this was happening on the perimeter, characteristics of the camp geometry did its own job. Silent. The contubern was the smallest social unit of the Roman army, 8 men sharing a store and a kitchen space, a mule of burden, and in the most practical sense, their lives. The word comes from the Latin store partner, and the relationship he described was so lasting and sulfur monoxide that the men of the same contubern refer to her in terms that they do not have precise equivalent in any modern language. Something between brotherhood, combat, comradeship, and family imposed by the war and playing for years of marching. The store itself was called Papilio. By the way, it took when it was deployed 10 tanned calves, sewn with seams, waterproofed with oil and bait, forming a sloping roof structure, supported by central poles. Papillion weighed about 40 kilos in total, divided between the contubernium mule and some of the men during the march. Was not comfortable, was not designed to be comfortable, was designed to be waterproof, mountable in less than 15 minutes, and sufficiently insulating thermal for 8 human bodies together, generate enough heat to survive a winter's night in British or north of the Danubia. 8 bodies in that space were measured in square meters. Tight, the smell of leather sweat, wet wool, and animal fat that waterproofed the store was constant and inevitable. But the heat was real. And on campaign nights, we will have. What the heat was the difference between sleeping and not sleeping. The exact position of the papillion inside the camp was not garbage. Was assigned. The 80 men under the command of a centurion, occupied a specific to the camp, divided into a series of parallel streets, the Via. Inside that street, each contubernia had its numbered position. The centurion's store was always at the end of the street, oriented towards the main road. The optio was at his side. Those of the counterburnals of each section extended from there in fixed order. This meant something very concrete for a man returning from his shift on duty at 2 o'clock in the morning, exhausted, with the ears still alert to the silence of the forest beyond the vallum. I didn't need to think, did not need to ask, did not need to search. I knew how many steps from the guard post to the track, main, knew in which direction to turn. I knew how many stores counted from the end of the street. Could do it in complete darkness, without seeing, without a torch, without anyone up. The camp was a map I found on his body, not in his head, and worked just as well in full light than in darkness. Absolute of 3 o'clock in the morning. The centurion, on his part, did not sleep randomly inside the camp. Its position at the front of the street of its centuria had an acoustic as well as a hierarchical purpose. A Roman camp in the night was not silent. There was constant movement, guard changes, the passage of the messengers with the weaving, the movement of animals in the sting lines, the eventual sound of someone getting up to go to the latrine area, which by regulation should be at the extreme designated of the camp, never within inhabited space. The centurion from his store could hear the normal sound pattern of his sentry, and I knew with sadness that they only give years of practice. When that pattern was normal and when IT was not, that was the last layer of the system. Accumulated institutional experience was not written in any field manual, or was. None of these manuals has survived in their entirety, but it was in the bodies of veteran centurions, in its ability to process information, sensory during light sleep, of those who know they have responsibilities, even while resting. The centurion was not completely asleep when the camp was active, and I was in that liminal state where the body rests and the senses continue to work. And if anything in the sounds of the camp no longer fit the expected pattern, perceived it before his mind consciously could correct it. Think for a moment about the man on guard. Not the centurion, not the tribune, not the sleeping legate. Indoors in the praetorium with their own guards, personal, various thousands, the private. The man who has been assigned the third vigil that night. The hours between midnight and 3 a.m., the darkest and coldest. Those that the Romans themselves considered the harshest. It's winter in the ring. Temperature is below zero. Has marched 30 kilometers that day with its 40 kilos of equipment. HAS finished its section of the pit, has nailed its mural pile into the Ager. Higo has eaten his portion of frumen, the grain that is the basis of the legionary diet, cooked in the form that each contubernia entails. Sometimes it goes thick too, sometimes flatbread made from fire ashes, and has fallen asleep inside his papille before the cold of the night was unbearable. And then someone shakes it. The second vigil ends, it is your turn. The equipment is put in the dark. Lorica, Gladio Cape, leaves the store in a cold weather that after hours, inside the feels like a physical wall. The camp is silent in the specific way, in which only the places are silent, where thousands of people sleep. The torch at the guard post flashes 30 meters away. The man who relieves looks at him without saying anything, nods and leaves. And then the soldier is alone. Well, not completely alone, but to his right at 20 meters there is another post. To his left another. The vallum extends to both sides, and beyond the vallum the pit, and beyond the grave the non-Roman world. The rainforests do not make noise in winter. That is somehow the most difficult thing to do. Silence is not reassuring. It's the silence of a territory that knows you are there. But the soldier is not thinking about the forest the way we would think so. Is thinking about his position in the vellum sector assigned to it, in tonight's password, in the sound someone would make trying to climb the stakes in the snow. His mind is occupied with concrete information, with specific responsibilities, with the exact map of what you owe, monitoring and how it should react if something changes, and 3 hours later, and when the changing of the guard arrives and he can return to does it without thinking. Their feet know the way. Your body knows when to turn. Goes inside the store, finds there's space between the 7 bodies that continue to sleep, and in minutes he is asleep. This was what Roma had built. Not the absence of danger, but the architecture of trust. The legionnaire slept well, not because the world was safe, but because the system between it and the world made sleep possible in such a structured way, and so verifiable, that denying him confidence would have required an active effort. Contrasts this with any army medieval period of the following centuries. A century European diplomatic army, even a large and well-armed one, slept in a way that would have left plebeians without words. There was no systematic pit, and there was no ager built by the troops upon arrival. There was no distribution standardized camp that would allow orient yourself in the dark. The guard system, where it existed, depended on honor. Individual suspects who considered surveillance night as a task below its rank, or of servants and privates, without the training or the incentive to sustain it. And there was nothing comparable to Fusir to convert the responsibility of guarding in an obligation that no level of exhaustion could lead to ignorance. The result was that the medieval camps were regularly surprised at night, not always, not inevitably, but with a frequency that no commander, Roman Empire of the centuries of the Republic, or the High Empire would have tolerated as a normal part of the war. Germanic tribes lurking beyond the ring were extraordinary warriors. There is no sense in minimizing it. Men able to move through the forest in the dark, to coordinate attacks without audible signals, to maintain the discipline of an assault, surprised during hours of waiting. What made them less effective against the Roman camps? It was not a lack of courage or a lack of intelligence. Was that the system they were trying to penetrate had been specifically designed to thwart exactly what they did best. A 3-meter wide trench and 2 meters deep cannot be silently corrected. A palisade of intertwined stakes cannot be climbed without making noise, and guards who know that falling asleep at the post has consequences that no man of sound mind would want to face. Do not fall asleep. Polybium that was general, as well as he had seen armies operating in real combat conditions, described the Roman camp system with a vocabulary that in the Greek text has the taste of disciplined amazement. Was the only army I knew capable of establishing a fully defensible camp on any terrain at the same time as other armies simply needed to decide where to place the stores. I was not exaggerating, was describing an organizational asymmetry so deep that the result on the field was almost inevitable before an enemy could organize a response to the Roman camp. The Roman camp already existed, and it was already a city, was already Roman territory, and the morning arrived with the same mechanical precision as the night. The bucina, the field horn, sounded to mark every changing of the vigil. Buying the target signal arrived in every corner of the camp simultaneously. And the process that had begun upon arrival, construction, the assignment, the guard, began to be invested with the same efficiency. Stores were beat. The equipment was packed, the column was set in motion. Somewhere ahead, the messengers were already riding to the next place, and the cycle began again. There is something this system tells us about Rome that goes beyond military efficiency. Tells us something about how this civilization understood the relationship between the individual and the collectivity. The Roman legionnaire did not sleep because he was personally brave or because chance favored him that night. Slept because he was the beneficiary of a system that hundreds of men kept active while he did so. The guard at the Rin post, by verifying the password on teacher who had drawn the perimeter that afternoon. The then generations before had formalized the dimensions of the pit in a standard that was replicated on 4 continents. Simultaneously, the Roman dream in the campaign was not a necessity. Physics that satisfied, when circumstances allowed, was the product of a human architecture that required coordination and collective work investment. That note army was willing, or was able to systematically maintain. Rome sustained it for centuries. In British, in Syria, in the Sahara, in the Danubian steppes. The same pit, the same battle, the same third, the same snow before dawn, and the same soldier finding his tent without the need for light. That's what Polybium I was describing when I was writing with such amazement. Content? I was not describing stores or trenches. Was describing a civilization that he had decided that the dream of his soldiers was an engineering problem, and had solved it as such. Next time you see a representation of a Roman camp, the perfect order of the streets, the trench surrounding the perimeter, the guards at the doors, ask yourself if this image seems normal to you. If it does, it is because we have internalized the image. Without internalizing what it meant to produce, no other army in the ancient world could do that systematically. Every night, in any terrain, in any climate. Solo Roma. And I did it because sometime in the early Republic, had decided that nighttime vulnerability was a design problem and not a destination problem. What do you think was the most critical element of the system? Camp engineering or guard discipline? Leave it in the comments. We are interested in knowing your perspective. If this video made you see the Roman world in a way you didn't expect, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week in Buried Empires, we take a question about daily life in Rome, the Vatican, or the ancient world, and we answer it with the same level of detail and depth. Next week, how the Roman soldiers ate in the campaign, and why the procurement of the most powerful army of antiquity was, at the same time, one of its greatest points of vulnerability.